Hello, welcome to our Mythbusters team project. We would first like to start off by introducing ourselves, and then we will pass it on to Holland, who will explain our myth.
Hi, my name is Elvia, and I'm a second year civil engineering major.
My name is Arlene Mejia, and I am a civil engineering major.
Hi, I'm Leomi, and I am a third year managerial economics major.
Hi, my name is Holland. I'm a second year managerial economics major.
Hello, my name is Isabel Schellenberger, and I'm a managerial economics major.
Welcome to our project. Our myth is that employees have full speech rights in the workplace. Our myth basically states that the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech protects employees from being disciplined or fired by their employers for the things they say, whether at work, on social media, or in public life. Under this belief, an employer punishing a worker for their speech is seen as a violation of constitutional rights, no different than government censorship. So obviously, this is a myth. This means people are believing something that isn't true. Now, why is this happening? First of all, it feels intuitive. The concept of free speech and its extending rights feels intuitive because it's such a well-known and celebrated part of American culture. People grow up knowing that U.S. guarantees expression as a foundational right. It feels natural to assume that protection extends into all areas of life, including the workplace. Second, legal reality often isn't taught. Confusion is also common because the legal reality isn't something most people are taught. The First Amendment is a limit on government power, not private employer power, but this distinction is rarely explained in everyday education. Most people simply know they have free speech rights without knowing where those rights begin or end. Third, misinformation is easily spread. Another major reason this myth persists is that misinformation spreads easily due to a lack of general education around the actual limits of the First Amendment. This idea seems logical, that the constitutional rights follow someone around everywhere, so it circulates unchallenged and feels credible enough that people accept it without question. And lastly, business pressure. The reputational and cultural pressure the businesses face further reinforce this myth. When a high-profile employee is terminated over a public statement or social media post, the story is almost always framed by the press as silencing someone. A reasonable business person absorbs this framing repeatedly and concludes that disciplining employees for speech must be legally dangerous territory, whether or not the First Amendment actually applies. So we know that this is a myth and understand how people can get confused and believe this is falsehood, but what does the law actually say?
For the second part of our presentation, we focused on what the law actually says. We learned through textbook, course materials, and an outside source that the First Amendment protects people against the government's freedom of speech rather than private companies. In Chapter 2, the Constitutional Rights, when it was talking about the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment, we learned that the freedom of speech, religion, and press is protected, and the ability to petition the government. This includes symbolic speech, but this does not include private companies, which a lot of employees are employed at. Even though government employees don't have full right of speech, they do have some and more than private employees. Although all people are restricted from defamatory speech as well as anything illegal like threatening or obscene speech. In Chapter 24, Employment Law and Labor Law, we learned that most employees are at-will employees, and this employment comes from the common law doctrine, and either the employee or employer can terminate the contract under multiple conditions unless it violates the employee's rights. This can include freedom of speech and can limit what an employee can say that is acceptable in the workplace because an employer can still terminate the employee if it doesn't violate their rights. The National Labor Relations Act allows some freedom of speech, like the freedom to strike or unionize and speak out against unfair labor practices and being in labor unions. There's also good faith bargaining, which gives employees freedom of speech to bargain with their employer over wages and other things. Along with this, we looked at the whistleblower protections according to the U.S. Department of Labor, and this protects whistleblowers against retaliation from their employer, which protects some of their freedom of speech by allowing them to speak out against without getting any punishment. This is protected in many occupations, including agricultural work, customer, product, and food safety discrimination, and including employee safety and more. There are outside articles from the New York Times, and it was titled "Justices Set Limits on Public Employees' Speech Rights." And this confirms that the government does have restriction on government employees' rights, even though they work from the government and technically the First Amendment protects people from the government. They're still employees, so what they do in the workplace can still be limited to what they do in their private home. The justices ruled on a 5-4 ruling on Garcetti versus Ceballos that the Constitution does not fully protect speech for employees and limiting, like I just stated. And this case helped us fully round out our myth and put a practical element into it and see how past cases have influenced the freedom of speech laws, and see that the private context of a person's home is very different from being in the workplace or an employer context. During this case, the justices did note that when people enter a place of service, they do have to surrender some limits on their freedom, just being employed, and this small detail can really change the outcome of different cases, as we can see later on.
Where the myth fails. The myth fails when employees make offensive, disruptive, or threatening comments about another employee or about the company. A specific decision point happens when a decision maker, meaning a manager, business person, or an employer in power, finds out that an employee is making offensive, disruptive, or threatening comments about another employee or about the company. This can be done either through social media or at the workplace. This is when the business person has to decide what to do. They can either choose to do nothing or they can choose to discipline that employee. If the business person believes the myth that employees have full free speech rights in the workplace, they may decide to do nothing. This is because they think that the employee cannot get in trouble for what they say. This seems reasonable because a lot of people believe that the First Amendment right protects all free speech everywhere, including at the workplace. However, this is not completely true. The First Amendment guarantees 5 foundational freedoms, which include the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. It strictly protects them from government censorship, interference, or retaliation, meaning that it applies to actions taken by the government, state, or local entities, but not by private employees, employers, or companies. However, if the business person decides to take action, in most private workplaces, they have different company rules. A business person can discipline that employee that is making offensive comments against the company and decide whether those comments go against company rules. If the business person does nothing, then this means that the company could face problems like harassment complaints, a toxic work environment, lower employee morale, and damage the company's reputation. Instead, the business person should look and decide whether that employee's comments are going against company rules and decide to take the best approach.
So for the application scenario, a realistic example would be an employee at a private company posting political comments on social media. After the post goes viral, customers then begin criticizing the company and threatening boycotts. So then the HR manager kind of must decide whether to discipline or then fire the employee. If the manager does believe the myth that employees have full First Amendment protection at work, then they may avoid taking action because they think firing the employee would violate free speech rights. This seems pretty reasonable because many people do assume that free speech protects them from all consequences. However, I feel like this creates business and legal risks since the First Amendment mainly protects people from government punishments and not really actions taken by private employers. Since here an employee works for a private company, the employer can discipline speech that harms the company's reputation or workplace environment. And under the correct legal rule, the company should review whether the employee violated workplace policies and respond accordingly. while also documenting the decision carefully and applying policies consistently.
Moving into our business takeaways, correcting this myth is a strategic necessity for real-world risk management. The correct word matters because when a manager hesitates to intervene in a disruptive speech out of false fear for the First Amendment, they are also exposing the company to a massive liability. Some things that rapidly mutate into a hostile work environment are unchecked, toxic, or discriminatory speech, which could be claimed under Title VII, leading to lawsuit, brand erosion, and collapse in team morale. Businesses should also consider an explicit, transparent handbook with guidelines regarding social media use and workplace conduct. Employees must clearly understand that although they are entitled to their own opinions, they do not have the right to tie those opinions to their employer's brand or use them to harass colleagues. Finally, we must consider ethical implications. As leaders, our ethical responsibility is to balance an employee's personal autonomy with the psychological safety of the broader team. An individual's right to expression ends the moment that it compromises the dignity and inclusion of their coworkers. Furthermore, ethical leadership requires consistency. Management must force conduct policies uniformly across all political views, and failing to do so invites claims of discrimination and destroy workplace environment.
And to end off, here are our references. Thank you so much for your time.